sandals against marble, echoing through corridors lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on frescoed walls. Somewhere in the palace, senators are finalizing trade agreements. Somewhere else, guards are changing shifts. But here, in this particular hallway adorned with images of virtuous goddesses, a 15-year-old bride is learning that the cage built for her is lined with silk, and that silk can be torn. You don't know her name yet. You don't know that in 10 years, that name will become a curse word, a warning, a legend that historians will argue about for 2,000 years. Right now, all you know is that she's walking toward something, or away from something, and that the empire trembling beneath her feet doesn't realize the ground has already begun to crack. Before we step deeper into this story, I'd love to know, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. It honestly amazes me that a scandal from ancient Rome still pulls us in from every continent, every time zone. There's something about the past that refuses to stay buried. Her name was Valyria Messalina. The year was 38 CE, and Rome stood at a peculiar crossroads, still drunk on conquest, still bloated with plunder from Gaul and Egypt, yet haunted by the madness of Caligula, whose 4-year reign had just ended in assassination. The new emperor, Claudius, was an unlikely choice, a scholar mocked for his limp and stutter, a man the Senate thought they could control. To stabilize his rule, he needed legitimacy. He needed heirs. He needed a wife who embodied everything Rome claimed to worship: virtue, fertility, nobility. Messalina checked every box. Descended from Augustus himself, she possessed the golden hair and pale skin that Roman poets spent lifetimes praising. At 15, she was exactly what the propaganda machine required: a living statue of modesty, a womb for the dynasty, a symbol. But here's what the marriage contracts couldn't anticipate. What happens when the woman, chosen to be Rome's moral center, discovers that the pedestal they've placed her on is also a prison? What happens when she realizes that every rule designed to protect her virtue is actually a leash? At first, she played the role flawlessly. She gave Claudius 2 children, Britannicus and Octavia. She appeared at state ceremonies draped in the stola, the matron's robe that announced respectability. Ancient sources describe her moving through the forum with measured grace, her eyes lowered in the posture of submission that Roman wives were trained to perform from girlhood. The Senate breathed easier. The priests offered grateful sacrifices. Rome had its virtuous Empress. And then something shifted. The historical record fractures here, splintering into accounts so shocking that scholars still debate whether they're truth, exaggeration, or character assassination. But even if we scrape away half the accusations as propaganda, what remains is astonishing. Tacitus, writing decades later with access to imperial archives and eyewitness testimonies, claims that Messalina began slipping out of the palace after dark, not to visit temples or family estates, but to the Subura, Rome's red light district where the taverns reeked of cheap wine and the brothels operated in cramped rooms behind tattered curtains. She went disguised, her aristocratic features hidden beneath a blonde wig and heavy makeup, calling herself Lysiska. Picture the cognitive dissonance. By day, she presided over religious ceremonies honoring Vesta, goddess of chastity. By night, according to the sources, she worked in a brothel, competing with professional prostitutes to see who could service more clients before dawn. Pliny the Elder, compiling his encyclopedic natural history, recorded the detail with clinical precision. She once challenged Rome's most famous courtesan, Sylla, to an endurance contest. Sylla collapsed after 25 men. Messalina continued past 30. Why would an empress do this? The easy answer is insatiable lust. That's certainly how Juvenal portrayed her in his savage satires, painting her as a nymphomaniac driven by appetite alone. But dig deeper and a different architecture emerges. Messalina wasn't just seeking pleasure, she was weaponizing it. In a society that divided women into 2 categories, the matrona, virtuous wife, and the meretrix, prostitute, she discovered that straddling both gave her a power no law could grant. The men she encountered in those brothels, the senators who recognized her despite the disguise, now carried a secret that could destroy them. One word from her, and their reputations would evaporate. Their families would be dishonored. Their political careers would end. She had stumbled onto a form of control that Caesar's legions couldn't match. Leverage built from shame. Back inside the palace, the transformation accelerated. The intimate banquets that Roman elites used for networking and deal-making became something else under Messalina's orchestration. Imagine the scene. Couches arranged in a horseshoe, senators reclining in their finest togas, their wives beside them draped in silk dyed with Phoenician purple. The first hour followed protocol: roasted peacock, honeyed dormice, wine mixed with water as custom dictated. Then the wine flowed stronger. The musicians played louder, and Messalina, seated at the head, would begin issuing invitations that weren't really invitations. A gladiator would enter, still sweating from the afternoon's games in the Colosseum, blood perhaps still flecked on his skin. A foreign captive, beautiful and terrified. Sometimes the sons and daughters of the very senators present. What happened next was called entertainment, but everyone understood it as something darker, a ritual of domination disguised as festivity. Those who participated became complicit, those who witnessed became accomplices, and those who refused. They tended to suffer mysterious misfortunes. A tribune found drowned in the Tiber, a nobleman suddenly accused of treason, an aristocratic family losing their estate to debts they insisted they'd never incurred. The mechanism was elegant in its cruelty. Messalina didn't need to threaten explicitly. The pattern spoke for itself. Suetonius preserved a detail that still chills. She kept lists, names, dates, acts performed. Her freed women, former slaves elevated to positions of trust, maintained what amounted to blackmail ledgers, documenting the compromising positions of Rome's elite. When she needed a governor appointed to Syria, the documentation ensured compliance. When she wanted a rival family's property, the ledgers provided motivation. She had built an invisible empire inside the visible one, a network of shame that touched every level of Roman power. But perhaps the most disturbing dimension wasn't the sexual coercion. It was the religious mockery. Rome's power rested on the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods maintained through rigorous ritual. Priests followed procedures unchanged for centuries. Vestal virgins tended sacred flames. The calendar revolved around festivals designed to keep divine favor. Messalina took these sacred rites and perverted them. She would stage ceremonies honoring Venus or Bacchus, beginning with all the proper prayers and sacrifices, then transforming them into orchestrated orgies where senators and their wives performed acts that would have earned commoners the death penalty. By corrupting religion itself, she was making a claim that she, not tradition, held ultimate authority, that the gods could be bent to her will, just like men. The psychological devastation rippled outward. Imagine being a senator's daughter, raised to embody modesty, suddenly summoned to the palace and forced into degradation while your father watched, powerless. Imagine being a soldier, decorated for valor on the Rhine frontier, ordered to perform sexually for the Empress's amusement. These weren't just individual traumas, they were attacks on Roman identity itself. The city had conquered the world by claiming moral superiority, discipline, virtue. Now its own empress was proving that foundation hollow. And Claudius. The sources portray him as oblivious, buried in his historical research while his wife dismantled dignity around him. Some historians argue he knew but felt powerless, a man elevated to emperor precisely because he seemed controllable, now realizing he couldn't control even his own household. Others suggest a darker collusion, that he benefited from the blackmail network even as it humiliated him. The truth is probably simpler and sadder. He loved her. or needed her, or couldn't imagine the scale of what was happening in rooms he never entered. For years, the machine ran smoothly. Governors were appointed, policies passed. The empire's business continued while its moral architecture rotted from within. Then, in 48 CE, Messalina made the move that even Rome's tolerance for imperial excess couldn't absorb. While Claudius was in Ostia overseeing grain shipments, she staged a wedding. Not a secret affair or a private ceremony, but a full legal Roman marriage to Gaius Silius, one of Rome's most prominent senators. Priests officiated. Witnesses signed contracts. Dowries were exchanged. By every measure of Roman law, she was now simultaneously married to the emperor and to another man. A status that wasn't just scandalous, it was treasonous. It suggested regime change. It implied that Silius was positioning to become the new emperor. What was she thinking? Did she believe she'd bent Rome so thoroughly that it would accept this? Was she so drunk on her own power that consequences seemed impossible? Or, and this is the reading that haunts me, was she seeking her own destruction? Had she finally exhausted the thrill of breaking rules and needed the ultimate transgression to feel anything at all? The news reached Claudius through his loyal freedmen, former slaves who'd risen to administrative power and whose survival depended on his survival. At first, according to Tacitus, he laughed. The story was too absurd. But as evidence mounted, testimonies, documents, eyewitnesses, laughter curdled into rage. For the first time in his reign, perhaps for the first time in his life, Claudius moved decisively. He returned to Rome with praetorian guards, and the city that had whispered about Messalina for a decade finally fell silent. She was found in the gardens of Lucullus, those sprawling estates where the aristocracy once hosted poetry readings and philosophical debates. The sources describe her last hours with merciless clarity. She begged, she pleaded, she offered her children as hostages, as bargaining chips. She tried to invoke the gods she'd mocked in her ceremonies. When none of that worked, she reached for a dagger to take her own life, then hesitated. A soldier, tired of waiting, thrust the blade home. She died not as an empress, but as a woman who'd run out of moves. Claudius ordered damnatio memoriae, damnation of memory. Her statues were toppled and smashed. Her name was chiseled off public monuments. Her image was scraped from coins. Rome tried to erase her as if she'd never existed. But memory doesn't obey imperial decrees. The more they tried to bury her story, the more it metastasized into legend. Juvenal, Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny, they all circled back to her, unable to look away from the wreckage. 2,000 years later, we're still circling. Walk through the Palatine ruins on a summer afternoon, and the silence feels deliberate. Tourists photograph the arches and marvel at the mosaics, but beneath the beauty lies the residue of something Rome couldn't quite cleanse, the memory of a woman who discovered that virtue and vice are positions assigned by power, not nature, that the pedestal and the gutter are closer than Rome wanted to admit. That shame is a currency that can purchase kingdoms until the moment it purchases death. She didn't destroy Rome. The empire lasted another 400 years in the west, 1,500 in the east. But she revealed something that emperors and senators desperately needed hidden, that the civilization built on discipline and virtue could be controlled by someone willing to abandon both, that the people who claimed to rule the world couldn't govern their own desires, that the marble facades concealed rot. Perhaps that's why her story endures with such intensity, why it still feels dangerous to tell. Because Messalina's real crime wasn't sexual excess. Rome had tolerated that in emperors for generations. Her crime was showing that a woman could wield the same weapons of humiliation, corruption, and control that men had always used, and that when she did, the entire system trembled. She held up a mirror to Roman power, and what reflected back was so ugly that they had to shatter both the mirror and the woman holding it. The blade that killed her in those gardens wasn't just ending a life. It was trying to kill a question. What happens when the person designated to embody your highest ideals reveals them as performance? When the symbol cracks and something wild looks out? Rome tried to answer with silence, with erasure, with damnation. But 20 centuries later, in ruins where tourists take selfies and cats sleep in ancient shadows, her name still whispers through the stones. Not as Empress, not as wife, but as the woman who proved that empires fall not only to barbarians at the gates, but to the contradictions they lock inside their own palaces, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemy wears a crown.